Stareable Fest 2021 is a 4-day celebration of innovation in independent streaming series. We're a creator convention, bringing you the most relevant production workshops, panel discussions, giveaways, and an industry marketplace connecting the next wave of indie series to execs at AMC Networks, Blumhouse, Disney TV Animation, and more. We're a festival, screening your new faves, from rich fantasy to absurdist comedy, hosting an award ceremony, and several parties to kick it with your fellow fans and creators alike.
If you call me if you call
Hello, and welcome to today's conversation, our third conversation of the first day of Stareable Fest 2021. Meet the Showrunner, Chris Brancato. Stareable Fest is the premier annual indie TV and web series festival in the US, the new home for digital creative talent in the TV industry. We honor the year's best content and provide a space for the next generation of creators to connect with industry executives, grow their network, learn new skills, and build community. Stareable Fest is presented by Dell Technologies with NVIDIA, making workstation and monitor solutions purpose-built for creators like you. We'd also like to thank our other sponsors and partners, AMC Networks, Disney TV Animation, Rizzle, and Just for Laughs for making Stareable Fest 2021 possible. I'll be your moderator. My name is Ajay Kishore. I'm the founder and CEO of Stareable. And now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest, Chris Brancato.
Hey, Ajay, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Maybe as a way to get started, I'd love to have you just give us a sense of, what you do and a little bit about your work.
Well, I'm a feature and television script writer, primarily working in television, and over the years moved from writing on staff of shows to eventually show running a number of different shows. I'm either can be looked at as the person who co-created Narcos and Godfather of Harlem, or the person who's written 29 pilots which failed and never went anywhere. Either definition suits me just fine. But in any case, that's what I do. I primarily am the head writer on the television shows that I create, which in the American system of television allows you to then also produce the show. And we can discuss that as a sidebar. And on the feature film side, I'm primarily just a script writer and work on behalf of directors or producers.
Well, I'm going to guess that you don't get to showrun television shows without those sorts of failures that allow you to kind of learn and grow as a person and a creator. So maybe we could rewind and talk about, well, how did you get started in the business?
Well, it was quite a while ago that 30 odd years ago or so, I came out of college. I was aware that one could make a living writing. My mother was a professional novelist who had 9 books published, basically young adult novels. So I knew that there was a profession that one could make a living off of, but I just wasn't sure what avenue I would take. And a friend of mine who came out of college and was an actor, and he got on a television show. And I remember him handing me the script. The show was called The Equalizer, which is now on with Queen Latifah. But back in the day, It was in its original incarnation, the actor was named Edward Woodward. And in any case, I looked at that script and I sort of saw that my friend was going to go off and act in the show. And I thought to myself, okay, this is what I want to do. I was living on the East Coast at the time, and after several years of kind of knocking on doors and struggling here in New York, I ultimately in 1989 moved to Los Angeles in order to be closer to the center of the business. And as we were discussing prior to the broadcast, in those days, everyone wanted to write and direct features, and television, which really there were only 4 networks: Fox, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And in fact, Fox had just begun. And so television was the the landscape of television was far less exciting than it is today. It was mostly big tent shows that were trying to attract as many people as possible. And so, the cool kids didn't want to be doing TV. But for me, I viewed I was trying to enter a career, a profession where you got paid. And so I was wanted to be writing features just like everybody else, but I didn't turn my nose up at television. And that turned out to be a good decision because I ended up getting jobs on early TV shows in the 90s that I must say weren't terribly thought-provoking or brilliant. But what they did do was give me a sense of how one develops and writes for television, how you work in that unique form, which is a different form than writing features, and ultimately put me on a progression path that led me to become a showrunner in television. And then, of course, the business changed a lot through the advent of cable television and now the streamers. And television just simply became far more interesting because there didn't exist the same necessity to try to get 30 or 40 or 50 million viewers. You could do more niche programming. And that, of course, has allowed for shows that are phenomenal. And I've watched over the course of my career, people in features do a complete about face and flooding into television because that's where the action is.
So you got your start as a writer, and then I'm going to imagine along the way you started producing some of the shows that you were working on. How do you make that transition from working on others' projects to working on your own and successfully selling your own? Like, do you remember? I'm sure you remember the first project that you sold. Like, what was it, and how was that? What did that process look like?
Well, as I often say to people, back when I was trying to become a writer out in Los Angeles in the early 90s, it was actually easier perhaps to get on a staff of a television show as a writer than it is now to get a job as an assistant to a writer. In other words, the landscape was a little bit more wide open. The jobs were plentiful, again, in the sense that television wasn't for everybody. Not every writer wanted to be in television. And, a television staff is a hierarchy that goes something like this: staff writer, story editor, executive story editor, co-producer, producer, supervising producer, co-executive producer, and finally, executive producer at the top. That hierarchy, those are all writing positions. But what happened in American television is, with the 22 episode system that the networks used to employ, they needed scripts. And so writers gathered more power than they have, for instance, in the feature side of the business, where you only have to deliver your 2-hour script. And then, frankly, they can fire you or hire another writer, et cetera. But in television, the writer needed to be deeply involved in everything that was going on, because those 22 scripts were the bear that had to be slain. And so writers amassed a great deal of power in the American television system, so that as you climbed up the ladder of this hierarchy, you started to be involved in producerial decisions. You'd be the only one who might know that next week we're going to need to build a hotel room set. In other words, the physical line producer of the show wouldn't know that. He or she isn't the writer.
Right.
So the writer, by having advanced knowledge of what was going on, and obviously being the person who presumably has a vision for the show, would start to get to make producerial decisions. And so the job of showrunner has always existed in television. That's really head writer and creative visionary. And showrunner is the equivalent in television to the feature director, who is the final arbiter of the creative in features. So the two positions have a lot of similarities. The difference being the showrunner actually hires directors to go accumulate the shots, and ultimately the showrunner receives a cut from the director that they then do another cut on before they decide whether it's finished and ready to put on the air. So I knocked around Hollywood in the early 90s. I was writing speculative features. I was trying to sell TV pilots. Again, the barriers to entry were probably a little bit lower, but what I would say to everybody in the audience is, you have to keep generating work, and whether or not people are buying it. And at first, they won't be buying it. They don't know you. They don't know who you are. They've heard every idea under the sun. And so the method by which you get people in positions of power, so to speak, to read your material is the eternal question of starting a career. How do you do it? And obviously, the festival you've created here is one of a number of different ways that in our new age, people can get their work paid attention to and noticed. You have companies that are sponsoring your series here, and who are very interested in discovering new talent. Well, it's up to us, if we're trying to break in, to try to find every avenue possible to get our work noticed and recognized. And it's extremely frustrating. It's extremely difficult. The people we're trying to get to pay attention to our work are busy, and they have their own clients, and they have their own projects. And so the last thing they really want to do in their spare time is be reading more material, studying more material. So how do you fight that dilemma? Well, the one thing I would say is this: over the years I've done this, when you hone your craft and when you actually create something that's better than average, better than good, that's truly special, that feels different, that is an indication of a unique voice or a unique talent. I've never seen something that's truly great not get recognized. And while that particular piece of work might not immediately get made into a television show or staged as a play or filmed as a movie, a great piece of work gets you recognized as somebody who's really qualified to do this, and oftentimes gets you your first job on something else. So really what you're trying to do at the beginning of your career is you're trying to create that calling card, the thing that we've all heard ad nauseum. But in point of fact, that is the way you do it. It's to try to create something that makes people sit up and take notice and believe that you're someone that they should be in business with.
I've heard that a fair bit, that TV used to look a little bit more like an apprenticeship system, where you'd start at a lower rung and you'd work your way up, and that makes sense, that you get more opportunities to kind of create something and create a conversation around, like, oh, this is something unique and interesting. Is that the way that you got that first, as you transition to producing your own content? Is that the way that you sold that first show?
Well, the way I did it was, again, everybody's story is entirely unique. Mine was, I wrote a speculative movie feature. I moved to Los Angeles, as I said, to be closer to the business. I volunteered to work for free for a producer at Paramount. So I was on the lot. Now, again, this is many years ago. And the speculative script I wrote, I happened to get into the hands of another producer who was looking for comedic material, which the script happened to be. And I ended up optioning it for like no money, but 10 grand to rewrite it or something. And now suddenly I had my foot in the door professionally. Meanwhile, by being in Los Angeles, I was making contacts with young executives who were at my level. They were just starting out. One of them happened to be a college friend of mine who believed in me and believed in my writing, and he put me on a few lists of approved network writers. So I got hired to write one script of some or other show. In other words, once again, this is a long time ago, and it's not really relevant for today, other than to say that I was very serious and committed about working on material that I hoped would be calling card material. And I was serious about understanding that this is a business. It's not just called show. It's called show business. And I took a look at what the companies were. There used to be something called the Hollywood Creative Directory, which would list every executive at every company so that I knew who the players were at my level. And ultimately, when I was able to, you often get an agent. You don't get an agent because your material is good. You get an agent because somebody wants to buy your material, and an agent wants to do the deal and commission it. So that's, of course, what happened with me. And so, look, it boils down to this. It's a little bit by any means necessary that you get people to see your material, look at your material. On the one side of it is the creative. You have to try to create work that stands out. And I'll talk a little bit about how you do that. But you have to do that on that. That's what you do in the privacy of your own writing space. But then the business side of it is, without driving people crazy, you have to try to somehow insinuate your material into the ecosystem. And it's hard to do, because it's really true what I say, Ajay. It's like the last thing I want to do is read somebody's script at the end of the day. I'm working on scripts all day long myself. And so for most of the time, I just simply don't, I need to have a personal life. So I can't just accept submissions from people, nor do I need to, because when I start to mount up a show, I figure out what my requirements are. That's when I do a search for writers, when I'm actually trying to create a writing staff for a show. But agents, managers, executives at different studios, they are looking for the next discovery, the next writer. And that's who you have to figure out how to get your material to. And how to do that is, again, unique to every single different situation.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are more shows being made, and there are more potential homes for the television shows, but at the same time, it feels like there's still no replacement from just going out there, having the conversations, building the relationships.
I would interrupt you and say, yes, there's the appearance that it must be easy to get shows on because there's so many of them, and it feels like there's so many different platforms, and we all have a queue of series we haven't even been able to watch yet because we're too busy to watch it, and we want to. But you know what? It's actually just as I have this conversation with creators all the time. It's actually just as hard, if not harder, to get a show on than it ever has been, because everybody's looking over their shoulder at what the next guy is doing. Every executive has kind of heard every idea. So how do you make your idea stand out and feel different? And the commitment that these companies make when they're going to spend for a series is 40, 50, 60, 70, $100 million to make 10 episodes. And that's a very big financial commitment for those companies. And so they slave over those decisions. So I think you have to be very, very cognizant that it's not just that. And by the way, a lot of bad TV shows still slip through the cracks. There has to be TV on all the time. So I don't mean to suggest that it's an incredible meritocracy where there are only good shows that get made. But the fact is, the field is very broad. The competition is very fierce. And it's very rare that someone sits at home, writes a speculative pilot, and it gets made into a series. What's more realistic is you sit at home and you write a speculative pilot, and the writing is really good, and the characters pop, and the thing reads like a bullet, and it feels fresh and different. And it somehow gets into an agent or manager or showrunner's hands, and they read it and they say, I really think this person is talented. I could use them for my show. So that it's more likely that beautiful spec pilot you write gets you a job on some other show than that it actually gets picked up and made. That doesn't mean don't do it. It's a way to distinguish yourself. But,
So you've said this, that, what ultimately matters, and it's always been true, is that you have to make your content stand out. And so when you think about, well, how does one do that? Quality, obviously there's no one definition for it, but are there different elements of a pitch or a project or a style of writing that matter? And has that evolved over the course of your career? Do you find like new things mattering more now versus, a decade ago?
Well, I think the thing that I see is, I've grown up in my career through the ranks with lots of executives who at the age I am now, my executive friends who are still in the business are very, very, very high up at the companies. And I've watched these executive careers develop. And what I realized at a certain point was I said to an executive, I said, hey, tell me what it's like during hearing all these pitches during the pitch season. And the person said, I hear 300 pitches. For several months, I'm there 8 hours a day, basically listening to one pitch after another. And he said, you'd be amazed. People come in and they say, we have this show about a warlock. And they're super excited about it. And they know that there's no warlock show on TV. And he goes, and then a week later, I'll see another group of writers come in and they'll go, we got the show about a warlock. And then a week later, someone else will come in and pitch it. He's like, it's almost like they come in batches and that ideas, come into the ethos and then suddenly they're pitched. And what I realized from speaking to him was that you really had to look for a way to make your pitch from the very beginning of the pitch feel like they're about to get an experience that they haven't had before. So how do you do that? And I think bringing up Godfather of Harlem, my current show, is a good example. I wrote a movie in the 90s about a Harlem gangster named Bumpy Johnson, and the movie got made with Lawrence Fishburne. I wrote that as a speculative script. I happened to have a friend who knew Lawrence Fishburne. I got him the script. Long story short, Lawrence found a director, and we ended up getting MGM UA to make the movie called Hoodlum about a gangster named Bumpy Johnson. Cut to 20 years later, a couple of producers called me and said, hey, Forest Whitaker is interested in that character. And would you be interested in doing a TV series about Bumpy Johnson, not in the 30s when you set the movie, but in the 60s, in the later part of his career? And my first reaction was, well, I've already done that. I've already done that story. I don't see how a television series is all that interesting. He's fighting against the Italian mob. I already did it. So I passed on the project, and a friend of mine, the producer, said to me, would this friend of yours be interested in developing it? And I said, yeah, he might. Anyway, my friends did start to develop it and then came back to me and said, hey, take a look at some of this material I have. Maybe you want to reconsider working on it. And when I looked at the material, I realized that in the 60s, Bumpy Johnson was friends with Malcolm X, the radical preacher. And suddenly I just looked at that bit of the research and it almost lifted off the page. And I thought to myself, I know what the show is. The show is about the collision of crime and civil rights. Further to that, when a citizen group is second-class citizen, be they Irish, Italian, German, African-American, when they're viewed as second-class citizens in America, oftentimes crime is the only way that they can advance their economic cause. And then as they advance their economic cause, they advance their cultural and social and political clout. And so I saw that there were connections between crime and how different immigrant groups integrate themselves into the fabric of American society. Suddenly I felt like I had a show that I could say is the collision of the criminal underworld and the civil rights movement. And I knew that no executive had ever heard that. Nobody's going in and pitching gangster shows about civil rights, and nobody's going in and pitching civil rights shows about gangsterism. I knew that I had an angle on it that interested me as a writer, and I was able to find, along with my other writers, many, many cross connections between civil rights and crime. So, for instance, the Italian mobster's lawyer is the same lawyer who fought for civil rights. It's super interesting stuff. And so that's what I really advocate to everyone out there who's trying to come up with ideas and figure out how to break, how to break the mold. If you come and say, hey, I'm doing a cop show, one cop's kind of a bad cop, the other's a good cop, and they go and they solve crimes every week. The fact is, you're going to have to figure out a spin on that makes it feel different than just any old procedural. And if you're going to pitch a show about a crime lord in the 60s, you better have a reason why watching that show set in the 60s has something to say about today. Right away, I knew that talking about civil rights and crime, I could touch upon things in the Harlem community of the 60s that are still painfully apparent today. Police brutality, voter suppression, poverty, crime in the ghetto, violence, homicide. In other words, I would be able to do things thematically that made sense to people watching in the here and now, but I'm setting it in the past, so it's a little safer to watch it. You're not being so controversial because it's set in the past. But my overwhelming point is, fire test your idea. Don't be satisfied when 10 of your friends say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Really because they will, they're your friends. The thing is to try to figure out a way to, in the most quick, reductive fashion, describe what your show is. Like, for example, it's Squid Games, which I'm sure we're all watching now. It's, it's a group of destitute people who get brought to a facility where they're going to challenge each other in murderous games to see who wins a lot of money. Well, first of all, it's got some real parallels in Hunger Games and other dystopian series and movies and television shows and books we've seen before. And yet it's South Korean. It's brilliantly directed. It feels different, even though it feels a little familiar, Hunger Games-ish, but they've done it really well, and they've put their spin on it. I'm watching it in an Asian community as opposed to with what Jennifer Lawrence, So Squid Games is something old, a dystopian thing where people are trying to kill each other to survive, goes all the way back to Lord of the Flies. And it also feels new. It feels fresh because it's in a different setting. So you're always looking to come up with something kind of familiar on the one hand, but that feels fresh and new on the other.
Yeah, that was a question that I had for you is, how do you know that something is a concept you want to spend years on and also is interesting to the market? And I guess what I'm hearing is, you want something that's like unique, but also has an authenticity to it and some depth to it, where you can continue to, within that unique situation, continue to scratch at the layers and uncover things over time, so that it never feels stale. There's always new areas to explore.
Television is really unique and different than features in this respect. Time moves along. And so one question I was always asked in the television world that I think is valuable to consider is, why here, why now? Like, why is this show important right now? If the show you're pitching could just as easily have been pitched 5 or 10 years ago, ergo a cop show, good cop, bad cop, and they go solve crimes every week. If it could be pitched 5 or 10 years ago, then maybe it's not the right show for now, because it really, television is about the mood, the moment. I think the reason Squid Games, or one of the reasons Squid Games is, popped, is because we're living in this very strange pandemic laden time where there is a large subsection of our world who are in dire poverty and hunger, which is mimicking this group of poor people who are sent off to do these games. And so long and short of it is, the show is connecting with a current mood. And so you can't really predict what the mood is going to be, because if you create a show now, it's not even going to be on the air for a year or two. But I do know this, with Godfather of Harlem, civil rights and crime, a Black community in the 60s and what was going on there. Well, we went and made the first season, and I think we had a lot of interesting things to say about how second-class citizen groups become part of the American fabric. Well, then between seasons 1 and 2, George Floyd was murdered. And that changed we knew going into the second season of Godfather of Harlem that we were going to have to factor some of what had happened in our country into the show directly. And we were going to have the ability to do it because we're filming in the safe remove of the past. And yet I can still talk about white supremacy. I can talk about voter suppression. I can talk about police brutality in that world. And people watching today will completely feel the relevance of it. So I think, to answer your question, gosh, I've spent several years going down paths, plenty of years going down paths with projects that didn't end up working out. That's part of the game. But also what you have to do is you have to sort of know or try to have a sense that at a certain point, you know what, I'm throwing good time after bad. It's time to push this one aside and be working on something new. And I always encourage writers to sort of, don't just think that the one thing you're working on is the only thing you're ever going to do. A writer has to be thinking about what's the project after this one is done and what's the next one. And oftentimes, as your career gets more successful, you have to multitask and do 2 things at once or 3 things at once.
Yeah, something I read recently that Squid Games was originally developed in 2009, and I think you can read that and say, okay, well, sometimes it just takes a very long time to convince the right people to make a show. But I think you're exactly right that there's a moment in time at which an audience wants a project, right? Like, one thing that I really believe is Ted Lasso, a great show, but I think there was also something about the last year where we as a society almost just craved like niceness. We just craved something that was like escapist and felt like easy in a certain way. And so that's why it really resonated with audiences.
I think that's entirely true. I also think that in 2009, for whatever reason, the powers that be in South Korea weren't willing to make that show, but they were willing to make it recently. I wonder why. I wonder what changed for them that allowed them to say to this filmmaker, go ahead and make it. Did his career get bigger, and did he get more powerful and have more juice? Was it a new set of executives? I mean, there's so many different reasons. Almost every hit show, you realize, is a series of weird, happy accidents that happen. So that it's hindsight is always 20/20 in these matters. But I think the thing to do as a writer is to be trying to be aware of how you're feeling and what you want to try to say. I mean, look, it's also a fine line. We're not necessarily trying to do school lessons here. I often talk about, like, I do television to try to entertain people. If I don't entertain you for that hour and make you want to come watch the next hour, my show's going to fail. So first and foremost is creating drama and entertainment and characters you want to come invite into your living room. TV is a different experience than films. Films, you go out into a theater and you watch on a 30-foot screen. Television, you invite these people into your space and you watch. And now increasingly you watch on your phone right up to your face, So the key there is creating characters who intrigue us. And, again, I don't want to keep mentioning Squid Games, but that's, those are characters who you don't even really like at first, but who get put in such a difficult situation that you start to feel for them. So it's, there are a lot of things you have to consider as you try to create a new show. But I would say that they boil down to why here, why now? Try to make it relevant to today in some way, shape, and form. Knowing that you can't predict the future, so think about what interests you. Come up with a way to pitch the show in a single sentence or 2 that really just makes it sound that makes people a little. Again, I knew when I said this is the collision of the criminal underworld and the civil rights movement. I could tell when I said it to the 1,000 people I probably said it to. I could tell they'd be like, wow, what does that mean exactly? And I'd say, well, it's about the friendship between a notorious gangster and Malcolm X. And that was only the tip of the iceberg in terms of crime and civil rights. But people would then go, oh. And then I'd say, well, I have Forest Whitaker to play the gangster. See, now keep in mind, what I'm trying to do when I go sell a show, and because I've been in the business for a long time, I'm trying to create a tsunami. I'm trying to create something that makes you go, oh, I get it. Oh, and trust me, it wasn't even so easy to sell the show with Forest Whitaker. People don't like to make shows set 50 years in the past. So it wasn't even so easy to sell. It seems in hindsight, oh, it must have been easy to sell a gangster show with Forest Whitaker starring. It wasn't. But you have to do it again by any means necessary.
So both Godfather of Harlem and Narcos, they examine these worlds of the crime and politics and systemic issues. You've touched on a little bit, but how do you think about your own obligation as a storyteller to kind of reflect morality and the realities of life, while also creating that sort of like drama that keeps audiences back? Like, do you feel beholden to push a specific perspective, and how do you think about your influences as you're framing the story that you're going to tell?
Well, that's a good question, and I've been asked it a number of times, because there's the opportunity with shows like Narcos and also Godfather of Harlem to glorify drug dealing. I mean, I write. Look, I like crime. I'm just I like gangster movies. So on the one hand, I'm just a fan who happens to be a writer who likes to write what he likes to watch. So, okay, so why do I like watching crime movies? People who are I'm not a criminal. Why do I like watching people who are willing to break the law? And what does that mean? And so I'm interested in trying to explore that within the context of the show. And I'm also interested in stories that have high drama. The DEA chasing after Pablo Escobar is a high drama situation. At the same time, the minute I met Wagner Moura when he was playing Pablo Escobar, he was so likable. He was so accessible. I was like, oh my God, the audience is going to root for him. And I remember thinking, oh, this is so good. You're not supposed to root for Escobar, but you like him so much, you're going to root for him. And that puts you as a viewer in a difficult situation that you can't help it. I like this guy, but I shouldn't like him. He's blowing up airplanes. And so I'm always, as a writer, looking to put the viewer in a deliciously difficult situation. At the same time, Pablo Escobar ends up dead on a rooftop, riddled in bullets. So the fact is, I do feel like at the end, and for Godfather of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was a heroin dealer, and one of the things I want to explore in this series is how he moves through a long arc of redemption to really understand that what he does has had a ill effect on the community. So I do think about the morality of these characters and the morality of what it is we're saying as a television show. And at the same time, I don't try to straitjacket myself. I don't, I also want to entertain you, and I hope that people who watch the shows have the good sense to not want to try to become Pablo Escobar.
I think with drug trafficking, it might be a little bit more hopefully black and white. But one thing you said about Godfather of Harlem is that idea that economically disadvantaged, marginalized people, that when they are excluded from legitimate professions, they turn to crime. I see that as a pretty progressive argument in a way. And so I'm curious, is that something that you're specifically aware of as you're crafting the story and the narrative?
Well, if you talk to any drug dealer, as I have, most drug dealers don't spend a lot of time worrying about the damage done. In other words, they go, there's a commodity that gets bought and sold. If I sell it, I'll make a profit. If I don't sell it, someone else will sell it and make a profit. And certainly in the Black community, it's like, if I don't sell it, then some white people from outside might come and sell it, and they'll take the profits out of the community. That was certainly Bumpy Johnson's attitude. He's like, well, at least if I'm selling it, I can keep the money in the community and do good things with the money too. So it's all very thorny and complicated, and that's what makes writing good, is when it is all thorny and complicated. Because to be honest, you could say, yeah, selling drugs, bad, it's black and white. Well, is it? Should they be legalized? Should they not? So there's so many gray areas involved in all this stuff. And I think it's the writer's responsibility, if they're really good at what they do, is to examine those gray areas, is to show. So for instance, Bumpy Johnson in one of the episodes in the second year really gets challenged about being a drug dealer by his daughter and by his wife. They're really on him about it. And it feels like you have to ask yourself hard questions about whatever your subject matter is and look for the different angles into it that then create drama. Different attitudes create drama.
And I guess, so for those two shows in particular, they focus on these communities that you as an individual are not part of, and I've seen you in other interviews talk about how, for Godfather of Harlem, Black women were the backbone of this community. How do you think about creating authenticity in those storylines? Are there things that you do to make sure that ensure that diverse voices in the writers' room are being heard and are kind of capturing the nuance required to tell these stories?
Absolutely. And there's just two very strong points to be made with that very good question. The first is this. If I'm writing about Pablo Escobar, what I'm doing is what I did. I'm going to Medellin. I'm interviewing the people who chased him. I'm interviewing narcotics involved lawyers and people. I'm doing research to try to understand the community, and I'm also bringing into the writers' room Latins and or whomever is going to have access culturally and spiritually and and in reality, a connection, a touchstone to that community. I think that's vital. I think it's important. At the same time, I'll say just as strongly that the minute we start to legislate who you can write about, we're doomed. In other words, I think a person of any race, creed, or color should be allowed to write about any race, creed, or color. But what they have to make sure they're doing is doing their homework and that they're inclusive to make sure that they're not excluding voices that can add to the reality and authenticity of what it is you're trying to do. So, yeah, I mean, I'm uniquely aware that all sorts of shows, I mean, I've also written Hannibal, and I've never eaten a human being. So, does that disqualify me from writing Hannibal? I don't think so.
No, I definitely don't think so. And you're right. I mean, I think it's.
Nor did I interview any cannibals. But that said, I did some research about it. So yeah, I mean, I think you have to be very sensitive to when you're writing shows that are squarely pinned in a culture other than your own. Then you're a fool if you don't do the homework and if you don't bring people onto your staff who have lived that experience or who know that experience. You're not maximizing your ability to tell stories.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I guess the question is always, can you with really good writing and with really good television, there's so much. I think one of the things it does is really capture the nuance. And so like, what are the effective ways? And yes, research is one of them, but I think there's also this opportunity to pull in individuals who have that sort of like a lived experience and have them write from that perspective of lived experience so that they can bring that into the project too.
Absolutely. And so it's funny because Rashida Brady on Godfather of Harlem was incredibly valuable in the creation of the Black female characters, but so was Heather Mitchell, a white woman who's looking at it from a woman's experience. And Heather and Rashida would sometimes have like a back and forth, and it would be really interesting. And I'd be like, wow, these are two really different lived perspectives. And as a writer, I'm like, what can I pull out of their argument here that's useful for drama in the show? And so that's what I think we all have to do as writers. We have to look at the different characters we're creating. We have to figure out ways to make them authentic. We have to figure out a way to give our characters oppositional viewpoints so that they create conflict, which leads to drama. It all boils down to that. You have to write conflict. So you have to give characters different points of view so that conflict can exist. And that happens, and in your writer's room, you can create friendly conflict in terms of people with different ideas about how characters should be. And any good showrunner avails himself of those other voices.
I guess that was in some ways what, assuming that you're bringing in these voices into the room, like the ways in which you create that sort of friendly conflict and that back and forth to see where the drama lies between these different perspectives, I would imagine is one of the ways that, you make sure that there's like nuance and accuracy to the perspective.
Yes. And it's giving writers in your room the freedom to criticize the script, perhaps that you've written. Hey, take a look at this. Tell me if what I'm writing is full of shit here. Hey, I have an angle for Elise's character. Does this strike you as valid? Then the writer might read it and go, yeah, I'm really on point with this. Or the writer might say, Chris, you're not a woman. You're really not thinking about it. And I go, you're right. I'm not. Please. I mean, every writer every showrunner who's good at their job wants that kind of input. They want to be told something they didn't know. And again, on a show, I have Paul Eckstein, who's Black, co-created Godfather of Harlem with me. So he and I have had, so many discussions about perspectives from his point of view that I could never arrive at because I'm not Black. And that stuff has filtered right into the show. So that's an ongoing discussion. It was on Narcos too. I had Latin writers who were really understood, and directors who really understood the Latin perspective on the United States. And I'm a person in the United States, so I don't know the Latin perspective on the United States and its government and its military operations. So again, if you're a good showrunner, you're trying to broaden your research angles. You're trying to broaden your staff to include voices that aren't yours.
One question we have from the audience, from Ben Ball, what are the best apprenticeship positions to get your writing chops from, since writers' rooms are more difficult to get into these days?
Well, I mean, it certainly is to be an assistant in a writer's room and be there. That was again pre-pandemic, when there actually were writers' rooms. Now these rooms take place over Zoom. I think the answer to that is, I think that what the internet and technology have provided us with is, first of all, there's so much more material on writing and how to write, and craft guides and discussions and podcasts. There's so much more of that exists, and none of that existed when I started. In fact, there was one book, Sid Field, like a screenwriting book. And then there was Robert McKee and John Truby. There were 3 screenwriting teachers that like on the planet. And now, of course, there's, John August and Craig Mazin have 500 episodes of the Script Notes podcast. And so I think that that's one avenue right there, is listen to August and Mazin. They're brilliant, you'll gain millions of dollars worth of free information from listening to that stuff. And then in terms of like the physical apprenticeship that's going to help get you landed onto a staff, well, I mean, while we can do these jobs from different corners of the world now because of the internet and et cetera, it still is probably true that getting to Los Angeles is where the center of the business is. So that I didn't want to move to Los Angeles. I wanted to be in New York, and so but ultimately, I said, gosh, I'm really not meeting people here in New York who can help me advance my career. And I've written the sample scripts. I even sold a script from New York to LA by dumb luck. But my career wasn't moving beyond that. And so I finally said, okay, I'm going to just do it. I'm going to suck it up and move to Los Angeles. So, that still is something that you have to think about. I'm not saying it's absolutely essential, and it might not even be essential if you just want to write feature films, but it's worth considering whether you should be in the place where they spend the most money on screenwriting, which is Los Angeles.
One question, we are a web series and indie TV festival. Are you seeing, people coming into the industry with this sort of produced content? And, are you seeing them, have you seen examples of them breaking into the industry? Any examples that you could potentially share?
Well, what I say to people, and I think it's true, I really could never visualize scenes when I was writing. At the beginning, I couldn't really think about how a scene really worked. I sort of wrote, I don't know, based on screenwriting courses I had taken or lessons. And it was when my stuff started to get shot about 5 or 6 years into my career, when I started to see stuff get filmed, I started to be able to write scenes better because I was kind of aware how scenes worked when you were actually filming them. I knew that you didn't have characters blabble on for 10 lines in a row in a TV show. You need to have more of a pace. And so the advantage that exists now, I kind of laughed when I saw the ad for the latest iPhone 13. It said like Hollywood in your pocket. And it shows people making really professional caliber cut material from an iPhone. And I thought to myself, this so symbolizes what's different between when I started and now, which is any one of you out there with an iPhone can go out, write scenes, hire actors amongst your friends or get your actor friends to be in them. And you can go film and cut. I mean, there was a movie at Sundance, 8 years ago that was made on an iPhone. So the point is this, you can actually be truly improving. And trust me, when you film and shoot stuff, it improves your ability to write it. It made the world of difference for me as I started to see my writing be filmed through the camera. I could see what worked better, what didn't work so well. I could now, as I was writing scenes, imagine not where the camera's going to be, but it just made it easier for me to visualize what a scene might look like when I'd seen actors play my scenes. So anyone out there can go do that this afternoon. Go shoot a scene. So I really encourage people to try to do that because ultimately your script is just a blueprint for somebody filming it. And there's so much that gets added as actors step in and start to perform. And as production designers and costume designers come in and start to costume people and find the right sets. All of this stuff is stuff that now for very little money, you can actually practice on your own. Whereas when I was starting, I kind of wanted to be a director at first. And I was like, yeah, but to film costs $125,000 a day with a crew. So I can't practice directing. It just didn't really exist in the same fashion. But more to the point, the technology today allows you to practice filming that will actually make your writing better. See what it's like when you write a scene and then go film it. Because guess what? If it plays like crap, then you probably didn't write it right. And you'll actually be able to see actors struggling with the lines if the scene doesn't have proper conflict, etc.
I mean, I think that makes total sense. When you think about that last step, though, of, to your point, passing people material and showing them that you have something unique, do you feel like it's different to pass someone a script versus a produced piece of work? Like, does it change the conversation or change the opportunity set in any way?
Well, there was this guys, I remember a bunch of years ago, some guys did something called Script Fellas. And it was like a clever take on Goodfellas, but it was about scripts or something. And like those writers got called into Hollywood and signed, and so that like I said, I think any piece of material you make, produced on your iPhone, produced at a very high budget, written brilliantly, any piece of material you create that really is good, that really stands out. See, the thing is, very good doesn't cut it. Lots of people are very good. And by the way, lots of people who make a living doing it aren't even very good. If the truth be told, there are people in, it's like any profession. They're baseball. Look, a baseball player who's batting 131 in the majors is going to lose his job soon, but he's a hell of a lot better baseball player than you or me. So the fact is, we're in the major leagues here. You're fighting against the best of the best. And so to just be good or even very good at the beginning makes it harder to break in than when you manage to do something that really just stands out. I wish I could tell people how to do it. Frankly, I wish I could do it myself with more frequency. It took me, I would say this, I was in the business for about 10 years before I finally wrote something that other people seemed to consider to be really special. like my first efforts might have sold or been optioned, made, and not the first efforts. The first few efforts went into the garbage, but a script number 5 or 6 or something, might have optioned it here or there, but it really took quite a while before I had enough knowledge and hard work and discipline to create a pilot that got made, that people really read as a sample, that was like, oh, okay, this guy has a kind of interesting voice, and let's hire. And of course, that show never was successful, but it got me hired for other stuff, which then of course gets you hired for other stuff. And that's the way your career, as Robert McKee says, is a marathon. It's not a sprint.
I completely believe that. And it's not linear, right? I think everyone wants to believe that life is going to be linear, but it's definitely not.
No.
So last question. Thank you for this. This has been amazing. I think it's an always interesting question to ask people who work in TV. It's kind of become the water cooler question of our time. What are you watching on TV these days?
Well, it's funny. If I wasn't during this little down period right now, where I'm waiting to start season 3 of Godfather of Harlem, I would say to you, I'm really busy writing. I don't have time to watch anything. And so there are times when I get into months of just output without input. And so, I have to confess, given what I said earlier, I heard about Squid Games like everybody else, or Squid Game. And I've been, I'm halfway through right now, and that's holding my interest. And what I'm also been interested in is these series that have been created internationally. In other words, we're now getting used to reading subtitles. I like to sometimes think maybe Narcos helped push that button a little bit. But, the biggest show in the world right now is something we're all reading the subtitles throughout. And so there are shows popping out of France, like The Bureau, of Spain. I was just in Madrid at a conference there. There were some interesting shows I want to look at. So I feel like we're, and this is a good thing for people listening and watching, is to go explore what other countries are doing too. See how they're making television on a lower budget, and sometimes with just writing that's so phenomenal that it'll inspire you. And I think it's important for everybody watching that's what great writing does when we get a chance to watch, is it teaches us. Like, I was looking at things in Squid Game the other day. I was like, wow, they really subverted my expectations. Writing has to do that. It has to subvert your expectations. When the guy goes to press the button, is he going to press stay or go? Oh, shoot, he pressed go. I thought he was going to press stay. So it's really, it's a unique opportunity to watch the great shows that are out today, and then apply it to your own writing. Look at what they're doing. Ask yourself why the show is so interesting. I think Squid Game, first of all, it does a nice job of handling a lot of different characters, So there's a good, whoever wrote that has done a good job dealing with the plates you have to hold up in the air. They've done a great job filming it. I think it's really well directed. They've caught a mood. For whatever reason, I'm in the mood to watch this depressing show right now. I don't know why, but they've managed to connect. Fauda is an Israeli series I love. Here in the States, I have a queue of ones that I want to watch. Mayor of Easttown, that's on my queue, and a bunch of others. But
thank you so much for being here. This has been an amazing conversation.
It's my pleasure. Thanks. Anytime.
I want to thank Chris again for joining us today and sharing his experiences and insight. Thank you all for joining us and participating in the questions and just being part of this amazing community. Stareable Fest is presented by Dell Technologies and NVIDIA, making workstation and monitor solutions purpose-built for creators like you. We'll see you next time. Our next session is tomorrow, Friday, from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. A panel on extending your content to other communities with Arj Makati of Pillars Fund, sensitivity consultant Alex Creswick, and creator Brant Rotnam, in conversations about storytelling in honest and complex ways across communities. They'll explore questions such as, can creators make their work more socially considerate of communities they are not themselves a part of? How can you ensure that your characters have depth and avoid stereotype? Make sure to join us tomorrow for that. Thank you again. Have a great day, everyone.